When Kevin headed over to Williams Media with Dr. Willow, they rode on the scooter because his Pagani was in the shop. A black car ran into his scooter after he parked it, and now the driver was blaming Kevin and demanding a lot of money to fix the dent. "At least I'm not trying to cheat someone out of his money because I don't know how to drive," Kevin said lightly. "Besides, this is a parking garage, not a public street. I'm allowed to park here, even with my little scooter." "You're a troublemaker, aren't you?" Logan Morgan said as he reached down and grabbed Kevin's collar. "I'll ask you one more time. Are you going to give me the money or not? And I'll keep telling you the same thing. You hit my scooter, my parked scooter. Why should I give you any money?" Kevin replied without changing his expression. "I think you need someone to teach you a lesson," Morgan said as he rolled up his sleeves and made a fist to threaten Kevin. "Logan, please calm down. We're on Williams Media property. If you attack him here, you'll be in big trouble." Charity pleaded with him, trying to smooth things over. "And you, Kevin, you should just apologize to him. Pay him what he's asking for. If you were more successful, you wouldn't be in this position." "Miss Boyer, I'm not sure I'd like what you're saying. What do you think is wrong with me?" Kevin said calmly. "You brat, just hurry up and pay me," Morgan shouted loudly. All the commotion started attracting a crowd. "Let go of him right now or I'll call the police," Dr. Willow said angrily. Morgan was a very big man, and Dr. Willow was really worried that Kevin would be severely injured if the man got his hands on him. Just then, everyone heard a pleasant voice saying, "What's going on here?" Morgan and the others turned around and saw Kevin's chief of staff, Miss Sandra Wilson, walking up to them wearing a very stylish business suit. Brittany Davis was following close behind. Although Miss Wilson's voice sounded cordial, she obviously wasn't pleased with what she saw. "Miss Wilson," Charity said excitedly as she stepped forward to greet her. At the same time, she glanced over at Brittany. The reason Charity was at Williams Media was to use her relationship with Brittany to get her own contract in the entertainment industry. She certainly hadn't expected to meet Kevin there. Most of the employees at Williams Media were either rich or powerful, so she and Morgan figured that even if Kevin worked for the company, he was probably only an entry-level employee. It would be obvious to Miss Wilson who was in the wrong in this situation. "Hello, Miss Wilson. This man left his scooter here in the parking garage. He even damaged my car with it. I think there should be a clear rule that only automobiles should be allowed to park here. Don't you agree?" Morgan said with a flattering smile. He had heard about Williams Media's CEO, who was hardly ever seen by anyone. He also knew that Miss Wilson had been handling most of the company's activities lately. As long as Charity signed her contract today, she would be a Williams Media client and could look forward to being a rich celebrity one day. So Morgan was careful to be as polite as he could to Miss Wilson. Dr. Willow, who was standing there watching all of this, got extremely nervous. Even though the situation could easily be resolved with a little money, Morgan seemed to be very unreasonable and demanding. She was afraid that, now that Miss Wilson was here, even if Kevin worked for Williams Media, he would probably be punished for doing something that could tarnish the company's image. But no one would have thought that Miss Wilson would ignore Charity and Morgan and walk right past them. She went straight up to Kevin and shook his hand as she very politely said, "I'm very sorry I'm late, sir. Are you all right?" "I hope you haven't been injured, Mr. Williams," Brittany also asked with concern. Everyone was shocked when they saw this. Was this shabbily dressed man actually the CEO of the company? They knew that he liked to keep a low profile, but this was too much. The Williams Media employees who were standing there started whispering to each other. "There's no reason for anyone to get upset here. After all, we're in the entertainment industry. Don't you agree?" Kevin said pleasantly. But it was obvious that he knew he had the upper hand now. "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams," Miss Wilson said very politely. "I take full responsibility and I promise that something like this will never happen again." She was very distressed that this had happened a second time and that it had happened to Kevin both times. She knew that her boss had a very good temperament, but she still took the whole thing very seriously. "Sandra, Miss Wilson, you must be mistaken. This poor man riding a scooter? How could he possibly be the CEO of Williams Media? Morgan asked in disbelief. In fact, it wasn't just Morgan and Charity who didn't believe it. The other Williams Media employees were also skeptical. But you couldn't really blame them. Kevin rarely showed up there, and every time that he did, he would spend all his time in his office. Apart from some of the senior executives, no one knew what he looked like. So you think I made a mistake? Like the CEO's chief of staff wouldn't recognize her own boss, Miss Wilson said indignantly. Morgan took a deep breath when he heard this and tried his best to remain calm. Fine. Even if he is the CEO of Williams Media, he can't break the company's rules and regulations. If he hadn't brought this scooter into the parking garage, this whole mess wouldn't have happened. With a boss like him, the company's future doesn't look very bright. Morgan lamented as he shook his head. Do you know how to read? Miss Wilson retorted as she raised her hand and pointed at the sign over the parking space. It's clearly marked that this space is reserved for our CEO, and the entire company is his, from the roof right down to this parking space. If our CEO wanted to, he could park a cow here. When he looked at the sign, which clearly stated that the space was reserved for the CEO, written in large red letters, Morgan felt like fainting. He was so embarrassed. So let me get this straight, sir. You parked in the CEO's space without permission, causing his vehicle to be damaged. So if anyone should be paying for repairs, it's you, Miss Wilson said coldly. Morgan's heart sank. He looked at Kevin and thought to himself, damn it, why are you doing this to me? You're the CEO and you show up dressed like a slob riding a little scooter. What was I supposed to think? Then Miss Wilson turned around and asked Kevin, Sir, do you need me to call the police? I think we're done here, Kevin said to her calmly. My scooter isn't worth much, so there's no need to bother the police. I have a solution, Miss Wilson said as she gave Logan Morgan a scornful look. Sir, you are not welcome on Williams Media property in the future. Please leave now, or I will have you removed by security. Kevin looked at the stunned man and smiled as he took Dr. Willow's hand. Let's go. I'll give you a tour of my company. If you're still interested, I can get you Brittany's autograph. Seeing that Kevin was about to leave, Charity realized that she had to do something. She had mixed feelings and regretted her behavior towards Kevin. She had been incredibly rude to him, and it turned out that he owned the company she wanted to sign with. Charity had really looked down on him. Now she just wanted to find a hole and crawl inside. But she was determined to turn this around and got up the nerve to call out to him. Kevin, please wait a moment. Professor Boyer, do you have any more lessons for me? Kevin said with a faint smile. No, I don't. This whole mess was all my fault. Please accept my apologies. But I do have one request. Charity's voice became softer and softer until you could barely hear her. Just see Miss Wilson and she'll take care of your contract, Kevin said very casually. After all, Charity Boyer had once been his teacher, and she had treated him well when he was in school. And Kevin had always believed that one good turn deserves another. Then he turned around to head up to his office with Dr. Willow. Even though Charity Boyer had just been very rude to Kevin, she had treated him fairly back when she was his advisor in college. So he decided to give her a chance and let her sign a contract with Williams Media anyway. Thank you, Charity replied gratefully. She suddenly felt incredibly relieved that Kevin hadn't held the whole parking garage incident against her. And she followed Miss Wilson into the Williams Media building. When Kevin and Dr. Willow got up to his office, he offered her a seat on the couch while he went to his desk and booted up his computer. Kevin, I really didn't expect to find out that you were the CEO of Williams Media, Dr. Willow said incredulously. Well, I'm not in the habit of going around bragging, plus, you never asked me, Kevin said playfully as he stared at his screen and skimmed the files that Miss Wilson had sent him. Over the past few days, 7 or 8 advertising companies had canceled their contracts with them. There was something fishy about this, and there was no way it could be a coincidence. Just then, Kevin's phone suddenly rang. He looked at the caller ID and saw that it was Tyler Dawn. As soon as the call connected, Tyler hurriedly got to the point. Kevin, Did you ask Lily to give her Jones family shares in that import-export company to Grandma Jones? Really? Why do you ask? Is something going on? Kevin asked as he started to frown. I just came to Chicago to work on one of my projects. As soon as I got here, I found out that all of the shares of the foreign trade company are now owned by the Jones family. Was this your decision, Kevin? Tyler asked apprehensively. I didn't know about any of this. Besides, I don't have anything to do with the Jones family anymore. As for the import-export company, you can do whatever you want with it, Kevin said as he abruptly hung up the phone. However, Kevin had already guessed what was going on. The Jones family must have taken advantage of his absence and stolen the shares from Lily. When he thought about this, Kevin felt particularly annoyed. He had repeatedly told Lily to hold on to the shares for as long as possible, but he didn't expect her to be so foolish. How many days had it been since he left? After thinking about it carefully, Kevin decided to call Miss Wilson into his office. Miss Wilson, please go and find out what's been going on in the Jones family for the past few days, Kevin ordered plainly. Kevin had given up on the Jones family, but he still didn't want to lose Lily, especially after all the time they'd spent together. On top of that, things had been going so well until that scene in his parents' hospital room. Yes, sir, I'll get on that right away, Miss Wilson replied. After a moment of hesitation, she asked him, Mr. Williams, there's one more thing I'd like to talk to you about. I'm sorry, but I'm busy right now, Kevin replied curtly as he continued to stare at a screen. The Pearl family is having an auction tonight, and we received an invitation to attend, Miss Wilson said politely. I don't have time for it, Kevin said as he gestured for Miss Wilson to leave. He didn't want to join in the fun. Besides, he'd always thought that auctions were just a way to artificially drive up prices on things that just weren't worth it. He wasn't in the mood to waste his money on one. Sir, you may want to attend this auction. The Pro family has several important projects with our company. Besides, I heard that there may be a dream lover necklace in this auction, so, Miss Wilson said with a hopeful look in her eyes. A dream lover necklace was something that every woman yearned to own. Although Miss Wilson was very well off, she definitely couldn't afford one. Still, she couldn't pass up a chance to see one up close and in person. When Kevin saw the look in Miss Wilson's eyes, he understood why she was so eager to attend the auction. He thought about how hard Miss Wilson worked to help him manage Williams Media, especially with all his absences lately, and he figured it was about time he did something to reward her effort. All right, then you can come along with me tonight, Kevin said with a smile. If they have one, I'll buy it for you. Thank you, sir, Miss Wilson said excitedly. She felt really lucky to be working for a CEO like Kevin. Someone like him only comes along once in a lifetime. Suddenly, Kevin turned around and looked over at Dr. Willow, who had been sitting patiently on the couch this whole time, and then he said, I'm sorry about this. I'll arrange for someone to take you to the hospital. That's okay, I can see that you're busy, Dr. Willow said understandingly, but she was still disappointed. Miss Wilson, please find 2 people to drive Dr. Willow to the hospital. Also ask my parents if there's anything else that they need, Kevin said very politely. Yes, sir, I'll take care of that, Miss Wilson answered excitedly. After Dr. Willow left, Kevin took care of some company business and then left his office with Miss Wilson at around 6 o'clock. Even though it was still early, many people had already arrived at the auction house. After entering the large hall, Kevin saw a familiar figure in the crowd. I had no idea you were interested in auctions like this, Kevin said as he patted Dalton Steele on the shoulder. At the same time, he made sure to greet his wife Miranda. To tell you the truth, I didn't really want to come here, but Miranda was bored at home, so she decided to check it out. I figured I'd see what all the fuss was about, Dalton explained as he looked around. How come I don't see your wife here? Kevin shook his head helplessly. He turned around and said to Miss Wilson, Please feel free to take a look around. I'll call you when the auction starts. Miss Wilson nodded respectfully and turned around to head over and look at the items that would be up for auction. So, Kevin, I see you didn't bring your wife along. But I do see that you're here with a very beautiful woman. Be careful or I may tell Lily, Dalton teased with a smile. Just then there was a commotion at the entrance to the auction hall. Kevin and Dalton looked over and saw Phoebe Anderson walking in dressed very elegantly. She was drawing a lot of attention. Not good, Kevin thought to himself. Because he'd been so busy with his parents for the past few days, he hadn't replied to any of the messages that Phoebe had sent him. Before Kevin could react, Phoebe was already standing right in front of him. She said happily, "Kevin, so you're here too. Why didn't you let me know? I just got here a few minutes ago. What a coincidence," Kevin said awkwardly. He could feel her father Truman's eyes burning right through him. At that very moment, Truman was standing in the doorway giving Kevin a death stare. "Dad, who is this guy? Why did Phoebe get so happy when she saw him?" a well-dressed man asked in confusion. "His name is Kevin," Truman said grumpily. Ever since Phoebe had come back from the camping trip, she'd been staying at home all day long. She was very unhappy, which made her father very concerned. When he found out that Phoebe might be worried about Kevin, who had been injured in the fight with the thieves, Truman wanted to tear him to pieces. "Dad, so that's the useless son-in-law from the Jones family that I've heard so much about?" he asked with a look of disdain in his eyes. "It's true that he's married to someone in the Jones family, but he's really not that useless." After saying this, Truman suddenly turned and looked at the man in the eyes. Then he said with a strange expression, "Isaac, it's still a little too early to call me father." "No problem. Anyway, it's going to happen sooner or later. I thought you might want to get used to it," Isaac Holden replied with a smile. "First, you need to do something about that brat Kevin Williams," Truman said as he patted Isaac on the shoulder and walked away. Isaac immediately understood what he meant. He walked over to Kevin and said snottily, "I was wondering where that smell was coming from." Then Isaac patted Phoebe's shoulder and gave Kevin a conceited look. "Isaac Holden, what are you doing?" Phoebe snapped at him as she pulled away from his hand. Then she hastily explained, "Kevin, don't get the wrong idea. I have nothing to do with him." "Phoebe, why are you explaining yourself to this parasite? Besides, your father has already given me his blessing. Are you still playing hard to get?" Isaac whined. He was definitely not pleased to hear her say this. "And who are you?" Kevin asked flippantly. "You want to know who I am? I'll tell you," Isaac said as he turned up his nose. "My name is Isaac Holden, and I'm the sole heir to the Holden family's pharmaceuticals company." "Pharmaceuticals? No wonder you're such a headache," Kevin said with a loud laugh. He didn't care at all when Isaac thought of him. When Kevin and Miss Wilson arrived at the auction, Kevin chatted with Dalton for a few minutes before Phoebe showed up. Truman Anderson was there too, and so was Isaac Holden, the man her father wanted her to marry. Isaac took an immediate dislike to Kevin and started insulting him. Of course, Kevin responded sarcastically. "Come again? Do you think you're funny or something? Why don't you go someplace else?" Isaac growled at Kevin. "Hey, what's the annoying sound?" Dalton said as he pretended to clean his ear. "Who the hell are you?" Of course, Isaac didn't know who Dalton was. That was because their families didn't travel in the same circles. "I'm your worst nightmare," Dalton said as he glared at Isaac. "If you're not careful, you may not be able to walk out of here." "Dalton, don't get angry. This guy isn't worth wasting your breath on," Kevin warned him with a smile. "Oh, so you're friends with this useless freeloader? Well, I guess you can't be very important, can you?" Isaac said arrogantly. "As they say, birds of a feather flock together, so I guess that makes you trash too." "You know, you've got a really big mouth," Dalton replied. He was getting more and more angry at Isaac. "Why don't you try and shut it for me?" Isaac sneered. "But let me warn you, if you touch me, you'll be eating prison food for the rest of your life." Just as Isaac finished his threat, Dalton pushed him in the chest, knocking him to the ground. Everyone around them gasped when they saw this. Isaac sat on the floor struggling to catch his breath. "What the hell? What do you think you're doing?" Isaac whined as he tried to get up off the floor. Then he pointed at Dalton and shouted, "You'll pay for this." "Keep pointing that finger at me and I'll break it off," Dalton snarled as he stepped forward. "Please calm down, dear," Miranda said as she quickly pulled her husband back. "Kevin's right. This piece of trash isn't worth your time." She knew her husband's temper very well. He didn't waste time talking crap or posturing. If you started a fight with him, you'd better be ready to defend yourself because you're going to get hurt. When he saw the murderous look in Dalton's eyes, Isaac immediately pulled back his hand. He was so scared that he lost all his confidence. Fortunately, the fight was interrupted by the start of the auction. "Kevin, let's go in," Phoebe said excitedly. She didn't want to talk to Isaac anymore. "Okay." Kevin agreed as he sent a text to Miss Wilson. Then he put his arm on Dalton's shoulder and guided him into the main room of the auction house. You had to admit that the Pearl family had a lot of influence in Chicago. Their auction house was as big as a football stadium in a part of the city where every inch of land was worth a fortune. Kevin and Dalton decided not to sit in the seats up front that were reserved for Williams Media. They casually found seats in a different part of the hall and sat down. "Kevin, have you seen the list of everything they have up for bids?" Dalton asked as he confidently crossed his legs and looked around the room. "No, why are you asking?" Kevin asked curiously. "I heard that there will be an auction for a batch of some newly developed herbal medicine, but no one knows its specific effects," Dalton said excitedly. When he heard this, Kevin's interest was immediately piqued. "Are you interested in bidding on it?" Just then, Phoebe walked over to Kevin. Pointing at the empty seat next to him, she asked, "Is anyone sitting here?" "Nope, make yourself at home," Kevin said with a smile. Phoebe sat down, looked Kevin in the eyes and said, "You could probably have anything you wanted at this auction, couldn't you?" Miranda smiled and spoke before Kevin could answer. "Miss Anderson, if I'm not mistaken, shouldn't your family have reserved seats in the front row?" When he heard this, a very enigmatic smile emerged on Dalton's face as his eyes swept back and forth between Kevin and Phoebe. "The first row is too boring," Phoebe said as she started to blush a little. "Yeah, the back row isn't stuffy at all," Dalton said teasingly. This made Phoebe blush even more. She really just wanted to sit with Kevin. How many days had it been since they came back from the camping trip? Phoebe had been worried about Kevin's injuries. How many messages had she sent him? But this damn man was so reserved that he didn't reply to any of them. When she thought about this, Phoebe started to feel a little resentful and it showed on her face. "Why are you looking at me like that? I didn't say anything," Kevin said with a bewildered look. When they heard this, Dalton and his wife almost laughed out loud. Just then, Isaac found Phoebe in the crowd and walked up to her. "Phoebe, why are you sitting way back here? The lighting is so much better up front," Isaac said as he gave Kevin this snooty look. "Why the heck should you care about where I sit?" Phoebe said impatiently. Isaac knew he had said the wrong thing, so he shut his mouth and sat down next to her. The auction soon started. Obviously, the Pearl family didn't want to keep everyone in suspense, so they rolled out the 4 Dream Lover necklaces to start the auction. The audience let out a collective gasp at the sight of the necklaces. Phoebe sat up in her seat almost immediately. She had wanted a Dream Lover for a long time. As a matter of fact, it was only because her father had told her that there would be one up for bids that she had decided to come to the auction. A lot consisting of 4 Dream Lover necklaces, starting bid $11 million, the auctioneer said loudly into the microphone. This immediately made most of the bidders very disappointed. Even though many of them were interested, the starting bid was already out of their range. Isaac was the first person to raise his paddle to make a bid. $12 million. He turned to Phoebe and said, "Don't worry, Phoebe, I'm definitely going to buy this for you." But before Phoebe could reply to him, the other bidders jumped in and started a bidding war. In less than a minute, they had raised the price to $25 million. Isaac looked at the people in the front row in shock and thought to himself, "These people must be nuts, buying 4 used necklaces for $25 million. Suddenly, a woman held up her paddle and shouted, $35 million. This brought a disappointed sigh from the crowd. This bid was $10 million more than the previous one. Isaac was really crestfallen. His family was rich, but this was ridiculous. Plus, he thought that these necklaces would be a waste of money. However, he had just boasted about buying it. If he stopped now, he'd look like a fool. Just as Isaac was about to bite the bullet and raise his pedal again, Phoebe spoke up. "Forget it. I really don't want one that much. It's not worth spending so much money." But did Phoebe really mean it? Of course not. However, she didn't want Isaac to buy anything for her. But if Kevin gave her something, even if it was a cheap trinket from a kiosk at the mall, Phoebe would still treat it like a rare treasure. "All right, since you said it isn't worth it, then I won't buy it," Isaac said as he secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Kevin instantly laughed when he heard this. At first, he was very impressed with Isaac's bid, but in the end, the guy had just turned out to be a show-off. "What are you laughing at, you piece of trash? Why don't you bid $40 million so you can give these necklaces to Phoebe?" Isaac scoffed. However, out of fear of being beaten up by Dalton, Isaac didn't say anything else. This really disappointed Phoebe. At first, she was excited that Isaac had made a bid for her, but now that he had gone back to insulting Kevin, she was no longer impressed with him. It was true that Kevin was just a lowly member of the Jones family, but he was a real man who dared to stand up in the face of danger. "Isaac, if you don't have anything better to do, just sit there and don't bother anyone. And if you don't want to stay here, you're free to leave," Phoebe said rudely. Then she added, "You really ought to learn when to keep your yap shut." When Phoebe talked to him like that, Isaac stopped acting so arrogant. "Phoebe, please don't be angry with me. I won't say anything else, okay?" By now, the bidding on the set of Dream Lover necklaces had already climbed to $51 million. That's when Kevin sent a text to Miss Wilson, who was sitting up front in the area reserved for Williams Media. The bidding on the set of 4 Dream Lover necklaces had gotten as high as $51 million. Isaac was relieved when Phoebe said that was too much money, but Kevin was willing to keep bidding, so he sent a text to Miss Wilson. Just as the auctioneer was about to let the necklaces go for $51 million, Miss Wilson suddenly held up her paddle and very calmly said, $58 million. There was a huge gasp in the room when she said this. What the heck? Spending $58 million just to buy 4 necklaces? Williams Media sure knows how to waste money, Isaac Holden murmured to himself in amazement. Actually, $58 million wasn't a huge amount of money for the company. However, everyone knew that Miss Wilson was backed by Williams Media and their CEO had a close relationship with Mitchell Cook, Adriana Wright, and several other powerful Chicagoans, so he didn't really care. The auctioneer smacked the gavel and shouted excitedly, "Congratulations, Miss Wilson, for successfully bidding on the Dream Lover lot at $58 million. Listening to the thunderous applause of the audience, Phoebe's heart sank. She felt that she might never have another chance to bid on a Dream Lover necklace for the rest of her life. After all, there were a limited number of them in the world. While she was still thinking about the necklace, a few staff members placed a large box on the auction table. "May I have your attention, please? We have a special item this evening," the auctioneer said enthusiastically. "I believe that everyone here is interested in the benefits of herbal medication. Some of you have already made great strides in having a healthy mind and a healthy body." Everyone got excited to hear this. Even the usually calm Dalton Steele seemed especially excited to hear about this. He had been exercising, practicing martial arts, and watching his diet for the past few years. It had all helped his focus and stamina so he could succeed in business. But he still couldn't get to the next level. Bidding on herbal medication, Kevin looked doubtingly at the box on the table next to the auctioneer. Are there still people working on developing new medications? Kevin thought to himself. Everyone, please calm down and listen to me. The formula for the pills in this box was developed 80 years ago. It was found in an airtight vault at a research lab in... Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to disclose the location, and it has been examined by a team of specialists. Who would like to be the first to experience this unique herbal medication? The bidding starts at $5 million. The auctioneer roared, instantly grabbing everyone's attention. $10 million, a man said as he stood up and raised his paddle high in the air. But as soon as he finished speaking, A woman on the other side of the room didn't want to be outdone and held up her own paddle to bid. 15 million. Suddenly, everyone was bidding for a lot of herbal medication. In just a couple of minutes, the bidding had already reached 20 million, and it didn't show any signs of slowing down. So, you can actually sell herbal medication like this. Kevin was speechless. He'd already sold his homemade pills to Archer and Quinn for $500,000 each, but this was ridiculous. Kevin had always thought that he'd made a fortune in business, but this was where the real money was. Dalton was about to stand up and raise his paddle to bid when Kevin pulled them back down to his chair. "Kevin, why did you stop me?" Dalton asked excitedly. He really wanted to try this herbal medication to see if he could finally make some more progress. "Dalton, this isn't a good idea," Kevin said seriously. "What are you talking about? I really want to try it," Dalton said impatiently. "Listen to me. This herbal med is probably the real thing, but even though it was kept in a hermetically sealed vault, it no longer has any medicinal value. You'd be throwing away your money," Kevin said as he stared at the box on the table up front. When Kevin said this, Dalton immediately settled down like he'd been splashed in the face with cold water. "Kevin, are you serious?" Dalton asked. He still wasn't sure Kevin was right. "Have you forgotten how I saved your wife?" Kevin said firmly. Just then, Isaac, who was sitting next to Phoebe, suddenly laughed. "You really are a joke. Just because you can't afford to bid, do you want to keep someone else from getting it?" "Who did I stop?" Kevin scowled. "Weren't you trying to stop your friend from bidding?" Isaac sneered and said. "You were just scoffing at me for not being able to afford the Dream Lover necklaces. Now you're knocking this item. Do you know anything at all about herbal remedies?" Isaac's loud voice attracted the attention of a lot of people in the row. "Whether you know if it would work or not doesn't matter. You couldn't afford it anyway," Kevin retorted. This upset Isaac, but he continued to attack Kevin. "Maybe I can't afford to bid on it, but I'll bet you can't either. What do you have on you? $100? The people around them burst into laughter when they heard this. Some of the onlookers recognized him as the guy who had married into the Jones family, and they started insulting him too. While this was going on, a man quickly walked up to Kevin, accompanied by a few staff members. "I'm sorry, sir, but if the two of you have some personal grudge against each other, I must ask you to take it outside," he said with a slight smile on his face. "Mr. Pearl, this is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to disturb your auction, but this man wants to start a riot," Isaac told him. Isaac Holden knew exactly who the man was. It was Zane Pearl from the family that owned the auction house. He wasn't as tough as Dalton Steele, but he still had a nasty reputation in Chicago. Zane was also in charge of his family's businesses and didn't get around much, so Kevin hadn't met him yet. Suddenly, Isaac pointed at Kevin and shouted, "Mr. Pearl, this piece of trash wants to start a riot and turn this place upside down. He just said that the herbal medication that's up for bids won't have any effect. He even told the people sitting near him not to bid." Phoebe immediately stood up from her seat and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Pearl. Please don't take him seriously. Kevin was just joking with us. How could there be a problem with something that the Pearl family has put up for auction?" "Phoebe, how can you defend this trash?" Isaac said as he turned around and looked at Kevin. Then he said to Kevin, "Why don't you man up and admit what you just said?" "Isaac, you've gone too far this time. Kevin was just joking with us," Phoebe pleaded. Zane wasn't happy with this scene. This was a very important auction, and his family had even asked him to be in charge of security. Although he had never seen Kevin before, he knew Phoebe and her family, so he had to be polite to her. "Well, since this gentleman was just joking, I'll just ask Miss Anderson to keep the discussion civil, so that we don't disturb the bidders. We don't want to influence the auction," Zane said quietly. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Pearl. Sorry about the disturbance," Phoebe replied quickly. Just as Zane was about to walk away with his people, Kevin suddenly stood up and said, "I wasn't joking with Dalton. This lot of herbal medicine is too old. Even though it was sealed for the past 80 years, it could be poisonous if someone took it." That really got everyone's attention. Isaac smiled cruelly and said, Mr. Pearl, did you hear what he just said? Kevin, what are you talking about? Phoebe said anxiously as she put her hand on his shoulder. Zane brought his guards over to Kevin and asked him, "Did you really come here to cause a riot?" "I'm telling the truth. The herbal medication in that box is useless," Kevin replied calmly. "All right, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Zane said with a sneer. "Zane Pearl, you really are amazing," Dalton said as he stood up from his chair. "Let me tell you something. Kevin is my friend. If you want him to leave, you'll have to ask me too. Do you really want to do that?" "Dalton Steele," Zane said as a look of recognition flashed in his eyes. He really couldn't afford to say the wrong thing to someone from the Steele family. "I'm sorry, this is all a misunderstanding," Zane said as he smiled and tried to calm Dalton down. "I didn't know he was your friend. If you'll excuse me, I have to make a phone call." Then he rushed off, leaving everyone to turn their attention back to the auction. After Kevin warned Dalton that he shouldn't bid on the herbal medication that was up for bids because it was too old to be effective, Isaac started arguing with him. They drew a lot of attention, and Zane Pearl walked over with his guards to warn them that they would be thrown out if they started any trouble. When Zane realized that Kevin and Dalton were friends, he backed down and walked away. After they all sat down again, Isaac whispered to Phoebe, "Why did you help this piece of trash just now? He needs to be taught a lesson." "Did you forget what I said to you earlier?" Phoebe said as she glared at Isaac. Then she turned around and gave Kevin a strange look. Phoebe liked Kevin a lot, but she still had to say something to him about this. "Kevin, can you stop saying foolish things like that? The Pro family is famous all over Chicago. They would never put anything up for auction that wasn't the very best you could find," Phoebe said very nervously. "If Isaac got you kicked out, who would help me appraise my antiques?" Of course, Phoebe didn't really care about that. She was more worried that if Kevin was chased out, it would be very difficult for them to ever see each other again. Kevin didn't answer Phoebe's question. He only nodded his head a few times. Meanwhile, the bidding had reached its peak. The bids were up to $45 million, and there weren't many people left who still had enough money to join in. Suddenly, an older man raised his paddle and said, $60 million. The room fell silent. They all looked over at the man who was dressed in a slightly old-fashioned pinstripe suit. "I can't believe all these people think this is so valuable," Kevin said to himself. 60 million going once, 60 million going twice. Sold for $60 million. The auctioneer said as she banged the gavel on the table. "Congratulations to the gentleman in the pinstripe suit for this unique purchase." Suddenly, the entire room burst into a boisterous round of applause. But a lot of people were uneasy about it. This older gentleman looked unfamiliar to them. As far as they could tell, he was virtually unknown in the Chicago business world. But they did agree that he couldn't be an ordinary person if he could afford to pay this much. The auction house staff carried the box over to him and opened it. The man took one of the herbal pills in his trembling hand and sighed. "I've been looking for something like this for almost 15 years. Everyone who saw him do this held their breath. Does he really know what he's doing?" Kevin wondered. Then a young woman said excitedly, "Congratulations, Grandpa." She looked like she was in her early 20s, and she was extremely beautiful. Her grandfather nodded excitedly and took the herbal pill right away. When Kevin saw this, he said to himself, "This isn't good. Something horrible is going to happen." "Gee, Kevin, didn't you just say that this batch of medicine would be useless? That guy looks okay, doesn't he?" Isaac said mockingly. He had deliberately raised his voice so that the people around them could hear him clearly. However, before Isaac could finish what he was saying, the older gentleman suddenly let out a strange moan. Then his eyes rolled up into his head and he fell to the floor twitching. "Grandpa, what's wrong with you?" the woman said as she knelt down next to him and started shaking him, trying desperately to wake him up. Everyone started to wonder what was going on. Was this a side effect of the herbal medicine that the man had just taken? They all turned their heads and looked at Kevin. This was exactly what he had predicted. Even Phoebe looked at Kevin in disbelief. Isaac was disappointed to see Kevin proven right and slumped down in his seat. He couldn't believe it and thought it must be just some kind of coincidence. When Zane heard all the commotion, he hurried over to the stricken man and asked his granddaughter, "Ma'am, does your grandfather have any health problems?" "What are you talking about?" she asked coldly. "My grandfather is in perfect health. There must be something wrong with the herbal medicine you just sold him." Everyone felt a chill run down their spines and no one dared to look her in the eyes. "Ma'am, I can understand your feelings, but there has never been a problem with anything this auction house has ever sold," Zane replied. "So you're saying that this is my grandfather's fault?" she asked him. Then she shouted, "Someone please help us." 5 or 6 men in black suits immediately ran over from the entrance. They moved so fast they were like a blur. "Listen carefully," the young woman told Zane. "If my grandfather dies, I'll definitely bring the Pearl family down." "Ma'am, it's just too early to talk about all of that. Let's get your grandfather to the hospital so they can check him out. Just don't try to blackmail us," Zane warned her. "Do you think I'm joking?" the woman said as she opened her wallet and showed them her ID. When Zane saw her ID, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't realize," Zane said apologetically. Kevin was standing too far away to see what she had flashed at Zane, so he turned to Dalton and asked him, "Do you know what that is?" "I'm not sure," Dalton said seriously, "but it looks like the Pearl family is in big trouble." Kevin raised his eyebrows slightly when he heard this. He never thought he'd witness something like this at an auction. "I'd advise you to move quickly," she told him. "Yes, ma'am," Zane said as he quickly turned around and barked orders into staff. "Quick, call an ambulance." "I'm afraid it won't get here in time," Kevin said gravely. "Please, Kevin, don't say anything else," Phoebe urged him as she anxiously tugged on his sleeve. Dalton didn't speak, but he stood next to Kevin, ready to help him no matter what happened. "Who is this guy? You think he has any idea what to do?" one of the bystanders asked. "Lower your voice. Don't you see who's standing next to him? That's Dalton Steele," someone whispered to him. As everyone watched, Kevin walked over to the man and announced, "He was poisoned by that useless expired herbal pill. Even if he was sent to the hospital right now, it wouldn't help. But he only swallowed it a couple of minutes ago. The poison hasn't spread to his internal organs yet," Kevin explained. Then he turned to look at the woman and said, "If you trust me, let me save your grandfather. But we can't delay any longer." "You really have a way to save him?" she asked incredulously. "Don't trust him, he's just a good-for-nothing," Isaac suddenly blurted out. Then he added, "Kevin, stop pretending you know what you're doing." When the onlookers realized who Kevin was, they remembered all of the awful rumors that Jason had been spreading about him and began to have their doubts. They started whispering all sorts of insulting things. This gave the young woman some misgivings, but when she saw the confident smile on Kevin's face, she decided to trust him. "I'll let you try," she said. Then she warned him, "But if something happens to my grandfather, I'll hold everyone here responsible." "Of course," Kevin responded. Then he turned around and asked for a bottle of water as he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small vial of herbal powder. Kevin had kept some of his antidote that he'd given Miranda. He thought it might come in handy someday, just not so damn soon. The older gentleman was in bad shape, but he was semi-conscious and still able to swallow. Kevin poured the powder in the water bottle and shook it gently. "Kevin!" Phoebe nervously called out as he leaned over and held up the mantad to give him a sip. "Don't disturb him. I'm sure Kevin wouldn't do something he wasn't confident about," Dalton said firmly. Zane nervously looked at Kevin. His forehead was breaking out into sweat. After a few minutes, the man's face started to look more normal. Even his breathing got smoother. Everyone who was watching this was amazed at Kevin's skill. Kevin slowly stood up and smiled. "Your grandfather is out of danger now. With some rest, he should be all right in a day or two." "Thank you," the woman said as she heaved a sigh of relief. "I'll definitely repay you for your kindness." After saying this, the woman had her companions carry her grandfather out of the auction hall and out to their waiting SUV. "That wasn't so great, just dumb luck," Isaac scoffed. But Dalton wasn't too happy to hear him say this.